But anyway, I lost the gold. It's in here somewhere.
Good.
There it is. I don't know. I didn't know ribbon was in short supply until I tried to get one of these over my head. And I found out that ribbon must be very expensive.
The person just making it stuff.
Seriously, there are times when it is appropriate, and there are times that it probably is inappropriate. This may be one of those times. But we're going to talk today about someone who really was self-promoting. And that's really kind of what, in a way, our trophies can do. They can, we can put them on our resume, I guess. I thought about lining up all my trophies on this shelf back here in front of the baptistry, but then I remembered I didn't have any. So that's why I am hanging on to these. I may have to display them up here somewhere, probably just in my office. So, as you probably figured out from my scripture reading earlier, I want to talk to you today from the book of Esther. Most of you know the story of Esther. Esther was a young woman, maybe a teenager. She's part of the Jewish people that have been carted off to Babylon. They're in exile. They are not free. They're slaves. I'm not going to talk about the miraculous way that she came to be queen. I could spend a lot of time on that, but I'm going to jump ahead of that. Instead, I want to talk about someone in this story that is not normally the focus. He's a key player, but normally we focus on Esther, sometimes on Queen Vashti, definitely on Mordecai. But today I want to talk about this man Hammond. To refresh your memory a little bit, Mordecai is Esther's uncle. He's kind of her caretaker. She has become queen, and again, that's a story for another time, but there's this guy Hammond that was very much a self-promoter, very much into name dropping, doing things that may not really be very attractive to most of us. You see, he was concerned about Hammond more than anything else. In the course of time, he receives an award, and he was pretty high up in the government. But everybody was to, pay him homage. He's somebody important. And so he comes by Mordecai, who is a Jew, and Jews kind of had a habit of not worshiping people, but of worshiping God. And so to Mordecai, there wasn't really a need to bow down to him. You remember during this period of time, Daniel is also on the scene. Of course, you have his book. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. There are a number of the Jewish exiles who have come into very prominent positions. And they've done so primarily because of the blessing of God. This was not a happy time for Jews. They were carried off against their will. Their home country was in shambles. Nehemiah was one of those exiles, and he later would go back and help rebuild the walls because they were torn down. The places of worship had been torn down. It was just not a happy time at all. And they were under the power of a very wicked king. Sometimes we forget that because in this particular story, Xerxes, who's no longer a Babylonian king, Babylon has been overthrown by the Medes and the Persians. Xerxes is a Persian king. And they had some really strange rules. One is, in our system, if a law is unproductive, Congress has the ability to change laws. Medes and Persians didn't change laws. They basically said, we don't change them, period. And so it kind of got into a problem a little bit later on, but the point is, that during this time, God has not forgotten his people. And there are those that are faithful to God even though it was not comfortable sometimes, not profitable. I mean, look at what it got him. Daniel ended up in a den of lions. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego ended up in a fiery furnace. And here we have this young Jewish girl, Esther, that ends up being in the harem. Is this one not working? How's this one? Better?
I don't know, I think I turned out.
Yes. Can I, are you hearing me?
Yeah.
Okay. I guess I'm supposed to, be real dramatic and get right up here in my mouth. So, we have this guy Haman that's wanting to be honored, and he walks past Mordecai, and Mordecai doesn't any. Doesn't show him the kind of respect he thinks he is due. And it infuriates him. Now, I don't know about you, but do you ever depend on the praise of men so much that if you don't get it, you are infuriated? I look out across the crowd, and I don't see anybody that I think would be in that category, and I'm glad of that. We're all pretty common folks. We just, assume that everybody respects everybody, and we go on. But this guy Mordecai was faithful to God, and Haman is jealous, furious, because he doesn't get the attention that he thinks he needs from this guy Mordecai. Now, Haman finds out just exactly who Mordecai is. He is a Jew. One of these exiles that have been hauled off from their home country. They've been brought in as, again, prisoners, but some of them have risen to extreme positions of power. Daniel is a big guy in the government, not only under the Medes and Persians now, but even before them in the administration, if you will, of the Babylonians. That's kind of unusual that they would keep somebody on. But the reason they did was he was good. He was faithful, even as a slave. We have Nehemiah, and I've jokingly called him the shortest of the Old Testament prophets because he was knee high. Maya. That didn't work either, did it, Chris? My jokes just got to go right over the top.
That wasn't joking.
But Nehemiah was cupbearer to the king. What does that mean? That means he sat down to eat with the king every time the king ate. Tested the food. It was so the king wouldn't be poisoned, but it gave him tremendous opportunity to create relationship with the king. And we know later how that proved to be very profitable, not just for Nehemiah, but for the whole Jewish nation. And so we have this guy, Haman, finds out Mordecai is a Jew, which already doesn't set well with him, and he figures killing Mordecai is just not enough. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever contemplated murder. I hope none of you, but can you imagine you contemplate murder, and then the more you think about it, it's like, that's just not bad enough. We got to do something bigger, badder. He wants to kill all of Mordecai's people. Kill them all. And he devises a plan to do that. Many of you know the details of the story, and I'm going to go fairly rapidly, but basically he gets a good idea from his wife and some of his friends, and that is, hey, you put up a spire, a spear, a pole, whatever you want to call it. And it's tall, it's what, 30 meters or something? I mean, this is a big deal. And have Mordecai impaled on it. These guys were were kind of gruesome. You know, they didn't just elect a chair or hang someone. They wanted to see blood and guts. They wanted to really do something dramatic, and so he planned that. Now, before all this had happened, Queen Esther had planned a banquet for Hammond and the king. She had a plan in place too. Hammond was very pleased with that arrangement. Who but him would be invited by the queen to have a meal with the king? That's really a pretty important honor, wouldn't you think? He was very proud of that. He boasted to his wife and to his friends, you know, who but him would have that privilege. And so he went to that banquet and found out that she planned another one the next day, and he was invited to that one. And again, he bragged about that. Now, the morning that he woke up and decided today's the day we're going to have Mordecai impaled, before he had a chance to carry that out, he found himself in the court of the king, and guess what the king had done? And here we see the involvement of God, I believe. You see, that night the king couldn't sleep. I don't know if you ever had that feeling. Had trouble getting to sleep? Well, he couldn't sleep. So what did he do? He decided to read. Well, what would he read? Well, he decided he'd read from the archives of the annals of the Medes and Persians. He would read history of his own country, his own history, some of it. And as he was reading through that, he come across the name of Mordecai. And I probably don't pronounce his name correctly and probably not consistently, but Mordecai, I believe, is probably a more accurate way of pronouncing it. Mordecai's name came up because he had once foiled a plan that two of the king's bodyguards had in place to kill the king. They were going to assassinate the king. Mordecai heard about it. He knew about it. He warned the king. The plot was thwarted. The king's life was saved. And so as the king read through that, he thought, well, gee, what did we ever do to reward this man? So he asked one of his aides there, and the answer was nothing. We hadn't done anything. So he decided, well, what should be done? Who's out in the courtyard? Well, Haman's out there. He's coming to see you. He's out in the courtyard right now. Bring him in. So he brings Haman in. Here's where we see that God has a sense of humor, I think, or a sense of irony. But the king says to Haman, what should a king do for the person that has really, really outdone himself in service to the king? Someone that the king wants to honor above all else. Well, now, if you're Mordecai, who would you, or if you were Haman, rather, who would you think fills that bill better than anyone else? You'd think it would be you. And that's what he thought. You can tell his head is probably swelling a little bit, but he's thinking, well, it's the logical choice that it would be me. After all, who gets invited to the banquet of the queen, personal invitation, but him? And so in that moment, he says, well, here's what you might consider doing for that person, whoever he might be. Put a robe on him that the king has worn. Put him on a horse that the king has ridden. Put one of the king's top people to lead the horse with that person on him through the streets of the city and proclaim, this is what the king does for those that please him. I just love it. I rejoice when I read the text and it says, okay, you go do that for Mordecai. Your arch enemy, the person you hate, the person that very day you were planning on murdering, and you had set a plan in place to murder all his people. It had been written in the law that can't be changed. Boy, Haman thought he had a pretty good setup going. He's going to get rid of not only Mordecai, but everybody of the Jewish nation there. He's going to eliminate them all, eradicate them. But his plan turns on a dime. Why? Because, as Daniel tells us, God is sovereign over the affairs of men. That is good to know, because sometimes we think the whole world is out of control. Doesn't mean that there aren't tough times. There were tough times there. Israel is in captivity. He allowed that to happen. You know why he allowed that to happen? We're told why. It was because the Jews had a fascination with idols. And finally, basically, he says, hey, you want idols? I'm going to put you in Babylon for 70 years. You're going to get your belly full of idols. After they came out, and I'll just kind of insert this, but once they came out of Babylon, they still had lots of problems. But a lot of the shine had been taken off idols. Why? Because they had their belly full of it. But back to our scenario here. Mordecai is then placed on the horse with the robe. Haman has no choice but to lead him through the streets proclaiming, this is how God, or the king rather, rewards those that it's pleased with. Now the reason I want to talk about this morning very briefly, Haman allowed Mordecai to steal his joy. You see, Haman had a high position. Haman had all the things that most people would say are the components of a happy life. But what took the shine off of it? The thought that someone else maybe had it better. You know, I've observed something. Most of you have lived long enough, you probably have observed it as well. When someone has difficulty, nobody likes to see them destitute, without home, without food, whatever. And they come to their aid, and that's a good thing. But there's always someone that's a little bit more concerned that we not do too much. You know, we don't want to spoil them. The reason is we want people to do good, but we want to do just a little better. And for some, that's an obsession. I don't know that it is with any of you, I pray not. But the idea that you can allow your emotions to be changed to the point that who's the unhappy person in this scenario? At every turn, it is Haman. Not the person that is just trying to live his life and please God and protect his people. But it's Haman, who seemingly has so much, but can't stand the thought that someone else would have something that he craves. We serve a God that is a rewarder. We know that because Scripture tells us that. He's a rewarder of those that seek him. By giving us praise, well, I don't know. I don't know that we serve God for the sake of praise. Matter of fact, I think that is probably not the primary motivation of a Christian. But we do serve a God that rewards those that are faithful to him. How do we know that? Because he tells us. He tells us flat out that he is a rewarder of those that seek him. So the conclusion there is, seek him. What about your attitude towards other people? Hopefully, Christians would not be so self-centered as to only worry about their personal gratification to the expense of others, like Hammond. Now, to finish the story, and most of you know how this story ends, the plan that Hammond had put in place set aside certain days that it would be open season on Jews, basically. They were to be eradicated. It was in the law, couldn't be changed. That's where Esther comes into play. And you recall the famous line, when she is encouraged by her uncle Mordecai to go in and approach the king about this problem. Because the day is set up where they will be annihilated. And she says, yes, but the rules of the Persian kings are you don't go in unless they summon you. And if you do, without a summons, you could face death. Because all the king has to do is nothing. I mean, if he accepts you, he'll hold up his royal scepter, and that'll mean, hey, it's okay, she can come in. If he doesn't do that, it's a death sentence. We don't comprehend it. That's not the way we function. But that's the way this king and that kingdom in that time did. And so in this scenario, this had been set up. The law couldn't be changed, but Esther has been encouraged by her uncle to approach the king about this. And so it's because of that she set up these banquets for Hammond and the king. And then when the time comes, the king says, well, what is your petition? And then she says, well, this man Hammond, and he's right there in front of her, has plotted the destruction of all my people, including this man Mordecai, whom you just sought to honor because of his faithfulness to you. Now it was the king's turn to be angry, and he was. Never let a good pole go to waste. He commanded that Haman be impaled on the very pole that he had set up to impale Mordecai on. Most famous line in the whole book was, if you'll recall, as she was being encouraged to approach the king, Mordecai says to her, who knows if this isn't the time, the reason that you're put in this time, in this situation. This may be the very reason that you're here. And so her response was, okay, so shall I go unto the king, and if I perish, I perish. So what has she done? She's placed herself in the arms of God, in the control of God. As a result, what did they do? Well, they allowed the king, they couldn't change the law, but they imposed another law, allowed the Jews to assemble in an area for those couple days where it was open season. They were allowed to defend themselves, and they survived that encounter because of the faithfulness of one man and one young woman, in spite of what evil men could throw at them. As we go through life, do you realize that there is that same God sitting on the throne looking over you and your adversaries? Some of you say, well, I don't have any adversaries. Well, that's good to a point, but beware when all men speak well of you. Is it because we've never taken a stand for anything? That's possible. maybe not always the case, but the challenge is we want to be faithful to God and let the chips fall where they may. Why? Because God rewards those that seek Him. In our Sunday school class, we're going through, reading through the book of Revelation. In my opinion, one of the important lessons from that book is that overcomers get a crown. You know, if you're faithful to God till the end, God will reward you. And that's what we seek, is the approval of God. We're going to sing a hymn of invitation. The invitation is real simple. As we go through life, are we focused on what others have instead of what God has blessed us with? You see, there's always someone that has more than we do. Always. There's always someone who has less also. Sometimes we focus on what we do not have instead of thanking God and praising Him for what we do have. And we have a lot. We still have the ability to meet freely and to worship Him. That's not something to be taken for granted. We have a lot of privileges. We have a lot of blessings that God has given us. Everything that we have, one way or another, goes back to a blessing from God. So what do we need to do? How about being grateful? Gratitude is what motivates Christians to serve God. Because of what He's done. We love Him because He what? First loved us and gave Himself. Let's stand.